Good evening, precious people of God, wherever you are. Precious people of Ukraine and Russia. Today, the 29th day of June 2024, Saturday, I come in the mighty name of Jesus to share with you a tremendous attack, a humongous attack. I see fire, humongous fire on the Russian territory. I see missile, I see drone sent by Ukraine to retaliate your destruction to their land. I see fire on your land, Russia, and Ukraine has penetrated deeper into your land. I see your base, your military base being tormented by missile. And I see like a building being destroyed by penetrating missiles to your land. They bring havoc. And I see jitters in your land saying, how can Ukraine penetrate us? And there were jitters among military forces, jitters among the people of Russia, people of Russia, and people across the global. When this thing come to pass, is to quicken us that, look, the Spirit Lord is calling upon you and me, that look, this is the hour now to flee from evil and turn back to him, that we may live right, walk right, and do right, and obey the sovereign God, the God of the promise, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Shalom, shalom.
Russian and Ukrainian officials met for a second round of peace talks in Istanbul on Monday, but the discussions ended nearly as soon as they began and without any major breakthroughs. Now, both sides did agree to work on a new prisoner exchange. However, on the matter of a ceasefire, statements from both delegations indicate that neither side budged on their positions. Moscow, for its part, maintained its maximalist terms, which includes Ukraine's surrender of 4 mainland regions that Russia attempted to illegally annex soon after the invasion in 2022. That's according to details of the peace memorandum reported by Russian state media. The direct peace talks came just one day after Ukraine's daring drone strike operation targeting airfields deep inside Russia. The Ukrainian president praised the brilliant operation, saying that the strikes were launched out of necessity.
We don't want to demonstrate our strength. We are demonstrating it because the enemy doesn't want to stop. We demonstrate it in a fair way on military targets. And we don't only demonstrate it to the Russian aggressors, but also to all those allies that once were strong allies and have now started doubting us. The trust towards Ukrainians and faith in Ukraine has returned.
Nick Payton-Walsh breaks down how Ukraine carried out the operation.
A bird's-eye view of humiliation. Ukrainian drones halfway across Russian Siberia, seconds from hitting the Kremlin's most prized bombers. But the data was bad for Moscow. 117 drones hitting 41 long-range bombers across Russia, a Ukrainian security source said. A torn-up skyline here in Belaya. Exactly what Moscow dreaded and Ukraine needed, a boost to its flagging morale. Damaging Russia's war machine for sure, but maybe also its calculus in peace talks.
Our Operation Spiderweb yesterday proved that Russia must feel what its losses mean. That is what will push it toward diplomacy.
Ukraine hit Irkutsk, 4,500 kilometers away from Ukraine, where Google Earth still shows similar propeller-driven aircraft in the open. But they also struck Alenia, right on the Arctic Circle. Similar planes also on Google. Another example of something that just was not meant to happen in Russia's brutal war of choice. The how was as extraordinary. Ukraine's security service head, Vasyl Malyuk, commenting here. And releasing these images of the wooden mobile homes they used the roof cavities of to hide the drones. Before their release, once Ukraine said all their operatives were out of Russia. The planes hit mainly the Tupolev 95 and Tupolev 22, the Ukrainian source said, aging, easy to damage, hard to replace. They were partly behind the nightly terrors that beset Ukrainian civilians. Whether these strikes make a dent in this daily toll will take weeks to learn. But it may also damage the Kremlin quicker, away from the front lines. Its pride hit hard. Although state TV put on a fierce display of why Russia has been pummeling Ukraine so relentlessly. It may also, too, change its thinking, perhaps towards peace talks that continued Monday in Istanbul, and of how long Russia can sustain this war if Ukraine keeps throwing painful surprises its way. Nick Payton-Walsh, CNN, London.
Here now is military analyst, retired Colonel Cedric Leighton. Cedric, just your reaction when you heard, I mean, this is estimates of some $7 billion in unrecoverable damage to these Tupolev bombers that predate Russian independence. I mean, this was really the Soviet aircraft that were targeted. Ukraine says as many as 40. That number may be in question, but Russia didn't have more than 100. And the significance here is that these were capable of carrying out long-range ballistic missile attacks into Ukraine. How big of a setback is this for Russia?
Well, this could be a huge setback for Russia, Bianna, and one of the key things about this is that the mechanisms that, we'll call them mechanisms for a second here, these aircraft that the Ukrainians hit, the Tupolev 95 and 22 aircraft, they are not only the aircraft that were used to attack Ukraine using cruise missiles, but they're also part of the nuclear deterrent that the Soviet Union and then Russia created. Not only for the Cold War, but in the post-Cold War period. And that's a significant thing because basically what the Ukrainians have done is taken out probably about a third or so of those aircraft from the Russian inventory. And that makes it very hard for the Russians to continue to prosecute the war like they did. The one other thing that they did was they took out an A-50, which is a so-called mainstay aircraft. That's an AWACS-like aircraft. That means command and control. So now command and control is much more difficult for the Russians to exercise while they attack Ukrainian targets. So this is a very significant development.
We know that it took about 18 months to plan, and the Lieutenant General, who's head of Ukraine's main security and intelligence agency, the SBU, said that these were ordered specifically from President Zelensky. And in addition to the task of smuggling the drones into the country, they followed later by small wooden mobile cabins, people familiar with the planning said, and then the drones were concealed underneath these cabins where the roofs ultimately retracted after months of just sitting there. And we've seen some of the video of these drones then flying out and striking these air facilities throughout Russia. And, you know, it's important to highlight the size and scale of Russia and where these aircraft were located. The impact that has now in terms of how safe and secure the Russian Air Force and the Russian military in general feels about where they store their military equipment.
Yeah, this is a significant vulnerability. The Russians clearly thought that they were going to be safe, especially in Siberia, although there have been some indications that other air bases that the Russians have, once closer to Ukraine, were much more vulnerable to Ukrainian attacks, and that's kind of obvious from a geographic standpoint. But what the Ukrainians did was they, in essence, opened up Russia to these so-called first-person view drones, and these drones don't have a very long range. But the very fact that they were able to, in essence, subvert the Russian trucking system to get these drones into those wooden houses and then kind of do a James Bond-like retract the roof, type system where they actually moved the roofs back when they were ready to launch, that really shows a very high degree of planning, a very sophisticated planning effort. And those 18 months or so that it took to plan this was basically 18 months very well spent because they not only looked at the target on the Ukrainian side, but they assessed exactly what it would take to go after all of these different targets, all of these different air bases that they hit. And these air bases included places in Siberia like we're seeing here, and then also places as far north as the Murmansk region on the Kola Peninsula in northern Russia above the Arctic Circle. circle. So these are the kinds of things that the Ukrainians did, and the planning was masterful. It's basically on the scale of what you would have seen in World War II when Winston Churchill told his version of the SBU, the Special Operations Executive in his case, back in 1940, he said, set Europe ablaze. Well, the Ukrainians have set part of Russia ablaze, and it's a very significant development.
Yeah, and I can't help but think of President Zelensky now in the Oval Office, going back to that disastrous meeting in February when President Trump and J.D. Vance famously, said to him, you don't have the cards, and knowing that he had at least this card up his sleeve and had been in the works for months. Could any of this happen, in your view, without the aid of U.S. intelligence?
Yes, it could have. I mean, there are certain things that the Ukrainians certainly benefited from when it comes to U.S. intelligence. But the fact is that there's satellite imagery available through private open sources such as Maxar technologies, so they don't necessarily need the U.S. to do this. They could have also gotten some intelligence from the Europeans. But the Ukrainians have a very extensive intelligence network within Russia. They've kind of proven that by conducting operations like this. And one thing we have to note is what President Zelensky said when he said that the, quote, office, unquote, meaning the, I guess, operational headquarters of at least part of this operation was right next to one of the regional headquarters of the FSB, the Russian State Security Service. So they were doing this right under the noses of the Russians, and that is certainly a very, very significant development from an intelligence perspective as well as from an operational perspective. Now it will, of course, depend on how long the effects are. This might not be as long-lasting a thing as the Ukrainians would like, but I think the effects are certainly there psychologically, kind of like the Doolittle raid, to use another World War II analogy, where we, attacked the Japanese and did it off of aircraft carriers, and the Japanese weren't expecting that at that particular point in time. So the Russians clearly weren't expecting this, and this is the result that we see right now.
I would imagine screenwriters are already busy working on Spider's Web and how they could turn that into a film as well. Cedric Leighton, thank you so much.